Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I interviewed the guy who's helping former Deadspin writers build a media outlet from the ground up. Back in late 2019, nearly all the writers for the beloved sports site Deadspin resigned en masse after butting heads with the private equity executives who owned the website. After they left, there was lots of speculation about where those writers would turn up. Would they simply get new jobs, or would they band together to create their own site? And then in July 2020, we got our answer. They launched Defector, an employee-owned publication that would be monetized mostly through paid subscriptions. To build the site, they turned to a guy named Austin Smith. Austin is the founder of an agency called Alley Interactive, and over the past decade, he's helped build and maintain the websites of many of the most well-known news publishers in the world. I sat down and interviewed Austin about his career in media, what goes into building a good publishing platform, and why he's recently begun working with news startups like Defector to help them get off the ground. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my Substack newsletter. Look, I know it seems like everyone has a Substack newsletter these days, but there's a reason mine has an open rate that's nearly twice the industry average. There's simply nowhere else you can go to get this level of in-depth analysis of the media business. I get emails every week from readers who tell me that my case studies make them better at their jobs. If you listen to my podcast but aren't subscribed to my newsletter, then you're missing out. To subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Austin. Hey Austin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, of course.
So you have a pretty exhaustive and extensive background in media, even though you're relatively young, but you kind of fell into it sideways, right? Like, how did you initially start working for media companies?
Yeah, was one of my first jobs as a freelance software developer was for Minnesota Public Radio, American Public Media in Minneapolis. I was, 21, 22. I growing up, I would say I was a big fan of news media. My parents subscribed to a large number of magazines and newspapers for I guess by comparison, and my mom worked in media for a while, but it wasn't something that I really thought that I would do until I was kind of in the midst of it. And I moved to New York in 2007 to take a job at the New York Observer, and I've not done anything but journalism and media technology since then.
Yeah, and you were hired by when Jared Kushner owned it, right?
That's right. We don't have to say his name too frequently, but that's that's correct. Yeah, and it was the end of the Peter Kaplan era. And when I started my company in 2010, the Observer was actually an early client of ours. They ended up for a time there, they had no one on staff to do any sort of like technology management or software development. So we handled that for them, I think until 2013.
And did you also work for the Economist Group, or was that just a later client once you started your...
No. So I had 3 full-time employers in New York City, kind of in quick succession, about a year at a time. The first was the New York Observer. The second was the Economist. And then the third was the New York Times Company, a subsidiary of the New York Times Company. I didn't work on their digital product directly.
And all these media companies, were you helping to build CMSs from the ground up, or was this kind of the era where they were mostly focusing on the platforms like Drupal and WordPress and just kind of modifying those?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And my co-founder Matt and I were very lucky to be on sort of a wave of adoption of Drupal in newsrooms, and the Observer was kind of a poster child for using Drupal in media. So it was an easy transition for me to go from the Observer to the Economist. This thing has been done on a small scale at the Observer, and now we're going to do it on a larger scale at the Economist. And a lot of the people that came to that project at the Economist were, had done various pieces of it, and were sort of forming a brief little bit of a Drupal supergroup. And actually a lot came out of that project. I think a lot of really important pieces, certainly to Drupal and its evolution as a media CMS, came out of that project. And my company, Alley, actually, we started as Drupal consultants, and have since switched our technology preference to WordPress. But I think way more importantly, we've broadened our focus substantially to include lots of other parts of both other parts of media technology, but also other parts of digital media product development, user research, design, strategic consulting, really the full gamut of product development services that a newsroom might need.
And when you were at this company, or sorry, when you were working full time at these companies, this was kind of the era when they still thought maybe they could put the toothpaste back in the tube, and if they could just have the right ad tech and the right targeting and everything like that, then they could get these great CPMs. Is this kind of true? Like, were you working with like a lot of maturing like ad tech companies while all this was kind of evolving simultaneously, while the rise of social media was starting to shift where traffic was coming from and stuff like that?
Yeah. I think that we were actually witnesses to the earliest part of that at the Observer. I remember the audience development manager, who's still a good friend of mine. We would sit in the same office together, and he would be sending instant messages on AOL Instant Messenger to Matt Drudge, like feeding Drudge these articles, political commentary. And when he got a hit, it was sort of like all hands on deck. The site's going to experience a bunch of traffic for a little while. And yeah, your point about ad tech, I think, is really a good one. There are still certainly media companies, and beyond that, of course, ad tech companies that are furiously looking for new ways to reverse engineer the tube of toothpaste. I would say that saga has not ended fully.
Yeah. Funny that you tell that story about the Drudge thing. Like, I worked at U.S. News and World Report around the same time, and they were constantly publishing like Drudge, what I would call Drudge bait, and then sending him links. And then whenever he would link to one of the articles, then it was like all hands on deck, because they would go into the article and start optimizing it to drive that traffic elsewhere, like putting in links to other articles between the paragraphs and all this kind of stuff, because they were trying to capitalize on all that Drudge traffic.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think news organizations were doing that, and to some extent they still do that around. It's like traffic destination pages. Gosh, I forget the publication, but there's one that actually took kind of a lot of heat for. It was like inbound links from Taboola would have just like 4 times as many display ads as normal. It might have been the Huffington Post. I could also be wrong about that. But yeah, like that kind of practice is. At least like immediately before the pandemic was still really prevalent. And yeah, I would say that we, our firm has sort of evolved along with the sort of sensibility about the revenue balance for news organizations. That early on, it's all ads all the time, and then the ad mix started to change, and what used to work in programmatic no longer worked anymore. It wasn't enough to pay the bills. So that led publishers to adopt Outbrain, Taboola, others like it. But Outbrain and Taboola even were not the earliest kind of on-site syndication providers. I don't know if you remember, but like a company called Daylife in the mid 2000s was doing something very similar, just without the sort of like monetization package attached to it.
Do you remember some kind of ad tech where it would actually add like inbound links to the actual editorial itself? Like if like in Business Insider, if it used some kind of like word like cell phone or something like that, it would create like a sponsored hyperlink.
Yeah, it would underline it in green, and you'd hover over it. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, man,
we've you name it, we've probably integrated it at one point or another. Although there was a point, though, I would say maybe 2015, where the ad stack was sort of taken out of the hands of product development and put into Google Tag Manager, and so that the monetization people could just do literally whatever they wanted without being otherwise encumbered.
Wow.
Depends on the
Yeah, I
publication.
remember.
That's like,
Yeah.
I guess, like the crassest way to look at it, but I've certainly seen that before.
Yeah, I remember like I was just during the era with like autoplay video, every site had it, briefly. And I remember like I don't know if it was like Fortune magazine or something, and I got hit by some autoplay, and I happened to know who the audience development person was for that, and I tweeted kind of snarkily at her like about how this is not great for audience developer, and she just tweeted back, she's like, it wasn't really my call, which is kind of amazing when you're talking about like how you're talking about it was taken out of the hands of the technical team. It's like these people who like this is their full-time job is to develop the audience, and yet they can't even control these horrible things that are making it harder for their jobs to be actually done.
Yeah, if you were looking at fortune.com after 2014, 2015, you were looking at our work. We built that site. Yeah. And it was absolutely not our call either. And this is, I think one of we haven't quite gotten to the sort of like recent shift in the mentality, but one of the nicest things about 2020 in journalism is that the editorial folks and the business folks have kind of run out of things like that to fight about. And it feels like there's a lot more consensus around where the industry needs to go from a revenue perspective.
Yeah, it seems like there are a few sites that still have autoplay. Weirdly enough, CNN, even though they're one of the few companies that actually produces good enough video that you don't need to trick people into watching it, but they still do it. Yeah, like it seems like there's like more alignment in 2020 between the revenue side and the editorial in terms of serving readers. We'll definitely get into that. So you said like 2010 or so. That's when you left your full-time job and started your own agency. What was that? What was the kind of motivation there, and what was the specialty of the agency?
Yeah. So we started Alley in 2010 to really just to do what we had been doing internally at publishers and just take a lot more control over our schedules and to be able to sort of scale what we knew to more publishers who really needed it, because there was a real dearth of software developers in New York who knew Drupal well enough to work at a like really high traffic publication, and were willing to do so versus, say, I don't know, universities were adopting Drupal pretty rapidly at that time also. So there was a really like busy market for Drupal developers, and we felt like we could effectively serve more publishers by going out on our own and starting to scale an agency versus just continuing where we were. So I was at Time subsidiary, and my co-founder Matt was at this Slate magazine at that point. I think I don't remember exactly what he worked on. The Big Money, maybe The Root, were Drupal sites, and then he and I had met at the Observer where we both worked, and it was sort of like the combination of the housing crisis and the kind of confluence of factors at the Observer that made it easy for us to say like, yes, we're going to take this jump. Because the Kushners got hit pretty badly in the housing crisis. They had to, like, in a pretty big hurry, they had to refinance 666 Fifth Avenue, which they had just bought, so they cut their exposure.
Such a shame.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that address number was, I think, prophetic.
Yeah.
But the where I'm going with this is that he, like, Jared and his managers had managed to like either lay off or induce every software developer who worked for them to quit. And so there was a point where it was like, oh no, there's nobody here that knows how to operate our website. So they ended up paying us, I don't know, a couple $1,000 a month to just keep the site alive nights and weekends sort of thing. And as they kind of rebounded, like that escalated, they needed more, and then they wanted to redesign the political site that they were working on, which is an interesting side story of its own, because the editor of that site is David Wildstein, who was pretty massively implicated in Bridgegate. So we felt pretty confident that we'd be able to piece together enough initial clients that we could have a go of it. And then we one of the second clients we started working for was Capital New York, which was founded by friends of ours from the Observer, Tom McGovern, Josh Benson, and Jillian Zamora and Jillian Reagan, who now actually works for Ali and runs our lead platform. But they started Capital, and I think it was in 2010, and we built the site for them, and then they were later acquired by Politico, and it became Politico New York. Politico, I think Politico and some other states too, as part of their operation for a while. So being I think early on some of the technology changes, and then we certainly are not. There are agencies that we knew back then who are still around today that primarily to this day mostly work in Drupal. But our motivation always was to really work in media technology, and we knew that we would follow the technology wherever it went in order to help publishers.
And so your kind of pitch to publishers is like, sure, there are tons of development firms out there, but we specifically have been working with publishers all this time. We understand your needs. We understand the landscape to a degree that your average Drupal developer or WordPress developer wouldn't necessarily know. We know subscriptions, we know ad tech, all that kind of stuff. So that's why it's worth hiring us over some other, generic development firm.
Yeah, I think that if you talk about just the technology angle of it, I think that's pretty accurate. At this point, we deliver most of our content management solutions on top of WordPress. But at this point, for most media companies, it's relatively far down the stack in terms of it's the content management tool, but when it actually comes to the user experience, there are a lot of different things coming together to make that work. So you would definitely not want just any WordPress developer to drop into a really high traffic news website. I think it's way more important to know how news websites work and to know what the trade-offs are, especially in terms of user experience, than it is to have a really deep background in WordPress. We've got lots of folks who are great at both, but it's really it's not something that comes up very much, I would say. And then our other advantage is just the rest of the package, right? If you need a redesign, or you need something between a migration and a redesign, we can help with all of that. And just because we work so frequently with news organizations, we tend to fit into their kind of cadence and existing infrastructure pretty seamlessly.
And so, kind of what, if I'm parsing what you're saying, is that the modern day publishing company, the CMS is just that's just the starting point, because there's really a tech stack where you're plugging in so many different things. You're doing more sophisticated stuff with email marketing, with pay gates, analytics, all ad tech, marketing tech, all that kind of stuff, where you're really cobbling together a lot of possibly some kind of CRM software, just a lot of different stuff coming together. And so how to operate all those tech stacks and how they integrate with each other.
Yeah, that's right. And those interactions get at the single most important thing to a news website is how rapidly the user experience loads. We know from repeated data that users will bounce off your site after some very low number of milliseconds of waiting for something to load, and it's easy to cram all of all those things that you just listed. You can cram them all into a website, and eventually the website will load. The trick is orchestrating them so that the most important things load first and they load quickly. And that's really like I think that's the difference in a lot of cases between successful media websites and unsuccessful ones.
And then you recently launched what I think you would call like a spin-off company that's separate from your agency called Lead, Lede. How is that different from your regular agency?
Yeah, I actually wouldn't classify it as a spinoff. I would classify it as a like being separate from the main course of consulting that we do. It is both a platform and a program for really, especially for media startups. But we think that we would also be a good fit for news organizations that need to make a sort more full pivot to digital first revenue stream. And what I mean by that is like in the pandemic, like lots of print organizations have seen their revenue take a hit, and almost every one of them has a website at this point. But the question is like, is their website really the like, can they survive on their website alone? And I think there are news organizations that are asking themselves like that question and deciding that they probably cannot. So as far as that goes, we think that we could be a good fit for some kinds of legacy news organizations. I'm talking specifically about Lead. Almost every customer that we work with on the Alley side is, has had a website for 30 years. Okay, 25 years. But
so with Lead, you're trying to build like a more turnkey product, whereas like a normal client for Alleyco, you might be doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of customization and something, but this is something where as you integrate new features and stuff, you can then very easily, as you take on a new client, just instead of reinventing the wheel every time, you're just like, here's the basic product or something like that. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. And I think in a nutshell, that's right. The thing that we're doing that is different, I think, than a lot of the other players out there that are trying to address this market, really is on the design and marketing services side. So we're essentially investing in an upfront project to create a design, build the whole website, and make it ready for publishing on day one. That doesn't necessarily look exactly like anything else out there. So every Medium site more or less the same, every Substack more or less the same. But we're putting in a lot of essentially early effort to help news organizations differentiate. And to that extent, really, we're a good fit for startup newsrooms. I don't really think that we're necessarily the right choice for solo operators, which I think has solo operators have a very important stake in the future of the media business for sure. And there are a lot of different things evolving that can address the needs of those folks.
And because it's geared towards startups, isn't it the way that you designed it is like you actually charge very little or nothing up front, like you actually shoulder those costs and then they are expected to pay back later once they start having a revenue stream. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's designed as a rev share, and yeah, there are options that require no cash up front essentially, and so that turns the conversations with publishers into discussion about it's more like we're the sort of like I would think low key friendly investors. Versus purely purely consultants, because it's important to us that we have finite resources. We can only launch so many sites onto our platform each month, and we want to make sure that we're to the best of our ability, we're picking winners.
But you don't take on equity.
No, and that's intentional, because we're not really set up to be a traditional venture firm or an accelerator. And philosophically, I don't know that that's a good approach for most of our potential customer base. really, what we're looking for is, you know, can we make an impact on their business, and can they pay for it over time, versus like we're going to have a seat at the table as long as they exist. I think we're really trying to equip cooperatives and emerging newsrooms to own their own destiny. The other piece of it is there's been a long series of I guess conversations would be a way to put it. Basically, since the Hulk Hogan trial and the demise of Gawker.com, there's been sort of an emerging wisdom that it might be better not to connect all of these publications so tightly. And I don't really have a position on that. I'm not a media lawyer, and I'm not a journalist either. But that rings true for me in a way. We need some financial exposure to their success in order to in order to essentially get paid for our work. But we don't need to own any of it, and we don't need the long term. I don't think we need the long term upside in order to make our initial investment worth it.
So what makes it worth taking on the risk? Because you could just choose to exclusively work with established companies that their checks are going to clear right away and they're paying up front and all that kind of stuff. So from your business calculation, why is it worth it to you to take on the upfront risk?
Well, yeah. So that's a really great question. There are a number of reasons. So for one, it is this model we found. This model is faster for product development because we can steer the conversation in a way that we kind of can't with publishers that are paying us as we work. We can say this decision is not going to monetize very well, or we can present them a set of options and say, we think you should go with this one. And it's been very, very smooth from that perspective so far. And I hope that the publishers we've gotten live thus far would say that they're happy with the results. I'm pretty sure that they would. In terms of the risk, it's a pretty simple question. Can you generate enough subscribers to cover this initial little project, and then the ongoing support and maintenance? And that we have ideas about what that number is, and we have ideas about who is a good fit for it, and we hope to be able to expand our criteria over time. Essentially, as the onboarding process gets easier for us, then we can take on projects that we're a little bit less sure about. The thing we don't want to do, though, that we're not going to be in the business of, is sort of deciding on the basis of our own perspective of the societal value of a news organization. Should we support you or not? This is purely about your ability to generate subscription revenue.
So let's talk about some of the specific projects you've worked on. First, let's talk about Defector. So, listeners are probably aware, but there was a much beloved company or blog that was started by the company formerly known as Gawker Media, called Deadspin. It was ostensibly about sports, but it really kind of covered all kinds of things like pop culture and politics, especially. They had a major run-in with their venture or private equity owners, who major disagreements on how they were running the company. And last year or earlier this year, I can't remember when, they basically all resigned en masse. And then they recently relaunched as a kind of writer-owned collective called the Defector. So this is one of, I think, the first projects under this new venture for yours lead. Tell me about how that project came about. How did those discussions come about?
Yeah. So it was last November. I ended up getting pulled into really early conversations with some folks that were involved at that point, and were looking to start something new. Like, I think that it was on everyone's mind when they left Deadspin together, that their ideal outcome would be to work together at a new venture. And there were a lot of different ideas about how that might be accomplished. And we, I would say probably had 1 or 2 conversations a month for probably 6 or 7 months. Sometimes it would pick up a little bit as they were getting closer to a decision. And then finally, in early July of this year, it was sort of like, okay, nothing's changing. The pandemic isn't changing. We need to do this. The world needs us to do this. We're just going to do it. And so there, I think his title is VP of Revenue Operations, but Jasper Wang. He and I worked together years and years ago when the New Republic was a client of Ali's, and he was on staff there. And so he and I had connected about his kind of growing involvement in Deadspin, because he didn't work. And sorry, in Defector, because he didn't work for Deadspin. He actually worked for Bain as the consulting company and investment group. And so as his involvement picked up, he and I started talking about what we could do. And finally in July, things kind of clicked, and they said, okay, let's do this. We're going to jump without a parachute and hope it works. So we said, yeah, that we support you in this, and we want to build you a website, and we can work everything else out later. And so that's what we did, and it was tremendously successful. They got a great many paid subscriptions on day one of having a landing page, and that was a little bit of like a aha moment where we realized that it was really just on the basis of the reputations of both the group of reporters and the reputation of the collective as a whole, that they were able to essentially build a business overnight. And that's cool. I think that's, for one, it's a really awesome story, and I'm super happy to have been there to see it. But for two, it's also an instructive model for other publishers that, especially if you look at the difference in economics between a startup like Defector and a legacy company, the percentage of their revenue that they can spend on their core job, their core editorial job, is so much higher than any legacy media company I've ever known. It basically lets them do a lot more with a lot less.
Because there's not like 500 senior vice presidents and managing directors and all that kind of stuff, like skimming off with these like huge 6-figure incomes, while each of the writers who are actually producing the product are only making like $50,000 a year or whatever, however most companies are structured.
Right. And that, that is a little bit like that what your sentence is in a nutshell is like the, I think spells doom for lots of different kinds of publishers, that it's impossible to shrink in a way that the market will accept, right? If you're a publicly traded media company and you say to investors like, hey, bad news, everyone. This year we're $1 billion media company, but we're gonna lose $50 million a year in market cap until we're a $100 million media company, and we're gonna be a profitable $100 million media company, but that's probably our true scale. Nobody's gonna accept that. So it forces, I think it forces this endless cycle of essentially attempting to make bigger something that that internet advertising decided in about 2005 that it wasn't going to be that big.
Yeah. And like, so for the Defector, it kind of was the perfect project or perfect kickoff project for you, because like each of these writers had their own personal brands, which they could combine and drive a lot of subscriptions that way. And obviously this was a super perfect one because they all happened to come from the same exact publication. So there was a lot of kind of brand equity, like people are just basically thinking of this as Deadspin too. So they got to kind of bring over some of that brand equity. Is that kind of, obviously you're never going to get that perfect storm with a lot of your future clients for lead. But is that kind of what you're thinking in terms of like recruitment for future things, is like, how do I get this group of writers who maybe write about a similar niche or topic and get them to come together and do this kind of collective, or however it's structured? And that's the kind of thing you want to invest in as in terms of as like startup costs.
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, we'd love to work with more groups of like-minded writers, and a lot of what's lined up for us to launch over the next 3 months is along those lines. What we're not going to do is try to make magic happen on our own. I for one, I think that reporters and editors are, like, they know better than anyone who they want to work with, who would complement their own output. And for two, I don't think that's going to be necessary in order to build this into a sustainable business in its own right. Just because this is so much where things are heading. What I would like to do is do a lot more sort of evangelism of this idea in local media, just because I think that there are some big changes in the offing currently, and probably more changes that will come in 2021 in terms of the sort of the destruction of local newspapers is a kind of fast, slow, fast story, and I think we're in a fast period right now, and accelerated like everything by the pandemic. You look at the consolidation that's happening, the injection of private equity as a bailout for new owners, effectively, for McClatchy. This is a pretty tough time, I think, to be in sort of legacy local media, at least on the print side, because they lack the sort of economic fortress that like TV still has to a large degree. And that's a little bit different of a different story than what we're doing overall with Lead. But my vision there is for digital only newsrooms to emerge that are competitive with local newspapers. And I'm not talking about markets like New York or DC, like any paper in those markets that lays a claim to the whole city that has survived to this day as a national news product. That it's the New York Times is just New York's lens on the entire world. Same thing with the Post, largely also true of the LA Times. But you go into any sort of mid-sized market in the country, or almost any mid-sized market in the country, except for the handful of papers that are owned by exactly right, a single billionaire owning the paper, propping it up, making it work. And and there are instances like Boston and Minneapolis where that level of involvement 5 years ago, I think, has I hope for their sakes that it's saved a lot of heartburn during the pandemic. All the work that papers there did to build digital subscribers. That's for every market that did that well under private ownership, there are 6 markets that are owned by big chains that are at the starting line and totally running out of time.
Yeah, and it might be advantageous in the sense that, like, usually when there are local news layoffs, like a bunch of people will get laid off at once. Like, so think of in a scenario like the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Just say they lay off 10 of their writers. Those 10 writers don't have a competing Richmond newspaper to go to, really. But they also just know they're beat really well in Richmond. They happen to have a decent following among people who live in Richmond. They could quickly group together and launch something with Lead or Substack or something like that, and be up and running pretty quickly.
Yeah, and those 10 writers, in order to build a business, a digital-only business, I would guess that they would only need 15 or 20% of the subscriber volume that that the paper would need in order to have a sustainable business.
Yeah. And so are you integrating ad tech for this, or are these purely subscription businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to this point, we're talking purely about subscription businesses, and that is sort of the industry trend that our project is tracking most closely. Defector launched with Warby Parker sponsorship, and yeah, we did that integration. To say that we would integrate ad tech, that might be a little bit of a jump at this point. We need to understand kind of what the scale of the platform looks like, and in a lot of cases, I think it would come across as being kind of off brand. You can ask the team at Defector how they would feel about that, but the I guess I would just say never. Sponsorships, I think absolutely that's valuable.
Like native advertising, stuff like that.
Well, yeah, and I also sort of think like there are, especially in sites where most of the readers are paid members, there are opportunities for advertisers that just don't exist anywhere else. Like, like I don't know, just off the cuff, send all of your subscribers some swag sponsored by Miller Lite, or this get a week's free subscription to Defector courtesy of Merrill Lynch. And I guess I'm callously throwing out real advertisers, but it's stuff like that I think we're more interested in exploring avenues like that versus throwing display units on the page and running programmatic scripts. Likewise with content advertising, Outbrain, Taboola, that stuff doesn't necessarily feel like it mixes super well with paid subs. The one thing that we've talked about with a number of our sort of industry advisors is this notion of monetizing like high traffic pages. So let's say that on Defector, Drew McGarry breaks a story, and they get a few 100,000 page views to that individual story, and we want to be able to do the math to figure out if the sort of like implicit local advertising of like, hey, you came here to read this story. Why not sign up for our email list? Okay, what percentage of people are going to do that? And then, okay, you're on our email list. Welcome to the Defector's free email list, and we're gonna ask you to subscribe as part of every email we send you. What percentage of people are going to do that? Is the return on that greater than the return on having programmatic that's just turned on for traffic spikes? And if not, is there any interplay between those two things? Like, does the presence in programmatic make it less likely for people to sign up? These are questions that that we definitely want to answer. And if it turns out that the best thing that we can do in order to capture the value of traffic spikes is a little bit of programmatic, I don't necessarily know that we would fight too hard about it. Although still, it's never going to be our first choice as a monetization pathway.
You also built a site for the Discourse blog, and that one's interesting because that's also, a spin-off from a site that was, part of the group that was formerly known as Gawker Media, called Splinter. They got laid off, I think, instead of, I think that was what it was. Then they launched a group blog on Substack. It was free for a while. Then they turned on subscriptions. As far as I could tell, the subscriptions were doing gangbusters. They were doing really well. But then they decided to move off of Substack and onto your platform. So how did that conversation start, and why what was the kind of thinking of why even though they were already sort of successful on Substack, they wanted to move over to what you guys were doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you should interview Alex on this podcast at some point and ask him that question, in brief. But I think a lot of it is wanting control over the way things work, over the way things look, the ability to have a much more kind of like blog feel in effect. And I also feel like they were running up against some just some general limitations in terms of okay, how do we really market to our subscribers on Substack? And it's I think for them it just felt like taking a big next step into into being a standalone publication of their own. And when the New York Times wrote about Substack, when Mark Tracy wrote about them 3 or 4 weeks ago, as of when we're recording this anyway, he referred to us, I felt sort of glibly, as a Substack competitor. I don't really think that's the case. I think that we're a very different use case, and publishers have to want a lot more out of their web presence in order to make the choice to jump over to lead. Just because honestly it's a lot more work running running a website that has a great deal more functionality, flexibility, just in terms of layout and content options. But I do think that it's more work and probably only a good fit for these like multi-party newsrooms.
How difficult is it to migrate off the Substack platform without interrupting the user experience for subscribers? Because they were able to take their paying subscribers with them via Stripe. How difficult is that?
The short version is it's not terribly difficult. There are a few wrinkles in the process. Our colleagues at Pico ran the Stripe migration, and we ran the data migration, the content migration. And I think between the two, like it was relatively smooth. Certainly something that we would entertain doing again in the future.
And so, like the paying subscriber, they're just continuing getting emails uninterrupted. But I was looking at the announcement about the relaunch of Discourse blog. But if they want to read the articles on the site that are behind the paywall, they have to go and set up a account with Pico or something like that, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So that's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more friction there.
Yeah, right. There is definitely more friction in terms of the site itself, because that's the point, is that there is a essentially membership section of the site that you have to pay in order to use. Although they're being, just from a survey of their site, they're being really generous about free content at the moment.
Yeah. So do you think this will be a trend where once publishers, because Substack has been trying to kind of beef up its publisher friendliness in the sense of like creating like multi-author functionality so that it's not just single author news sites where there can be multiple bylines. But do you think there will be this trend where once publishers reach a certain level of success on a more rigid platform like Substack, they'll want something more customized? Like they're just like, okay, now we're pulling in enough money to where we want to make this jump and start offering more bells and whistles and stuff like that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question. I'm honestly, I don't know enough about Substack or how it works to really comment substantively on that. I think email newsletters. So there are two trends here. One is sort of like users paying for news subscription media. The other is newsletters, email newsletters, full stop. And I think Substack like really neatly captures the intersection of those two trends. I guess I'm a little I don't know. I'm curious if email newsletters weren't popular because the web version of reading so much news was so cluttered and had so many ads and suffered from lots of the lots of the issues that we spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about already, in terms of general bloat. My hypothesis is that users will pick a great website over an email newsletter over a terrible website, and I think that it's going to depend a lot on the publisher. I think that there are some, especially again, smaller newsrooms, independent individuals, where a newsletter makes all the sense in the world because the cadence of the site is so unpredictable, right? Like if you send 2 newsletters a week, then you're pushing to your users or your readers, when you publish. But if your cadence is predictable, like Defector's, and you can go a couple times a day, a few times a day, and be pretty sure you're going to see something new, I sort of think the newsletter becomes less important. Of course, the Defector does have a great newsletter, and Discourse is going to continue to have a newsletter. So these things aren't mutually exclusive. It's just that websites are, by definition, just much richer.
So where do you see yourself 5 years from now with Lead? Like, do you think about putting out a platform that, like a very basic platform that anyone can sign up for, where they're not having to do as much customized stuff, and then maybe if they want to sign up for a bigger tier or something, like, or do you still want to be just working on with these sites on a more case-to-case basis?
Well, right. I think that question is more about like the what the industry is demanding from the internet, and how the interplay between changes in the internet and changes in news media impact businesses like this. I right now I would say no. I don't want to have a turnkey platform. There's so much out there that you could go to Webflow, you could go to Ghost, you could go to any number of different places on the internet and have like a low code solution to building, either low or no code solution to building a website. I just don't think that market is super interesting, and I also think that that folks that are starting enterprises like this are going to need help, especially with design and marketing, and those are things that you can't do in a truly turnkey sense. Once it's turnkey, it's no longer custom. So this trade-off is something that we definitely are probably going to wrestle with over the next 5 years. But I hope that 5 years from now we're not running a completely turnkey digital platform. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Sitting here now, where I would like to be is with a large group of really diverse publishers doing lots of different kinds of journalism on this platform. And as I've said repeatedly, I would love for more local news to be part of that. Really, like even before Defector came along and inspired what we did on Lead, we worked with the Civil First Fleet a couple of years ago to deliver a platform for them, and the sites that we continue to work with are our Block Club Chicago, the Colorado Sun, and the River, which is a news site in the Hudson Valley, and they're I think all great examples of what we would love to replicate in more communities of really authentic, locally owned news organizations. In some cases, they're drawing funding from civic nonprofits, community foundations, and it's really important to us to find a way to work in that ecosystem too.
Okay, awesome. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
So for Alley, we're alley.co, alley.co, and our lead site is joinlead.com. And if you have to ask how to spell lead, then no.
You're not qualified to get one.
Maybe so.
Okay, well, that was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.